and thank you for joining me for this review of a non-fiction history book, which I enjoyed a lot. It's not my normal over of science fiction and fantasy. It is very much non-fiction and it's very well written. I also listened to it as an audiobook, and I believe it was narrated by Richard Trinder. And the narrator did a fantastic job of bringing the writing alive, and he made his best. It's not a funny book, but it does have irony and bits of sly humor, and the author did well with it. I don't have the cover to wave around, so I'm just going to have to salute you with this amazing Viking drinking horn, which I have drunk from a number of times, both ale and mead, so that's historical, right? Okay, Viking Britain. I really enjoyed it. I didn't previously know about the author, but I looked him up for this review, and he seems quite interesting. So he's a historian specializing in early Middle Ages, and he's a former curator of the British Museum. And in the 2014 International Exhibition of Vikings Life and Legend, he was the curator or project curator. Now, he's got a whole heap of other stuff as well, cultural heritage studies. The interesting one that I thought was for his PhD, he investigated the relationship between landscape and warfare in early medieval Britain. And that also comes through really strongly in this book, which was published in 2017, I believe. It's fairly recent, but not hugely recent. Okay, so Viking Britain, an exploration. It's telling the story pretty much of the Vikings in Britain. I loved this book, and I was surprised when I went on Goodreads to find that a lot of other people weren't quite as enthusiastic. Even ones that gave it a high star rating often criticized things about it that to me didn't make a lot of sense. So one thing that Thomas, the author, does a lot is he will set a scene. He will write this beautiful verbal picture. It's basically a fantasy. It may be a man coming back to a longhouse after a journey. It may be the feelings and emotions of a person who lands a ship on the shore. It may be any one of those things, and sometimes it's a woman. Having set the scene and given you this beautiful fantasy visual, he will then talk about the source. And it's often an archaeological find, many of which I hadn't heard about, as well as sagas and writings often from Great Britain. Now, while I've read a certain amount about the Viking era in Scandinavia, I haven't read that much about Britain, so I thought this was really fascinating. There were many things that I did know, of course, but there were plenty that I didn't. I loved this multi-step approach. I loved the fact that we were setting a scene with scarlet capes and dramatics and emotions, making it feel real and vivid before going to the actual finds. And the author makes it quite clear that that setting of the scene isn't something that we can know. We can never know the emotions of these people. It's very hard to know the actual facts about Viking era anything because the Northlanders didn't write things down. So a lot of the things we know about in Britain came from British writings, and they often were written down a good 100 years later, and many of them were written for propaganda purposes, in the same way that Shakespeare was an Elizabethan author and so cast aspirations on previous monarchs. That's been happening throughout history. History is narrated by the victors, basically. I think I'm misquoting someone. Never mind. Anyhow, so Viking Britain and exploration. It starts with a brief comment by the author about when he was curating the Viking exhibition in 2014. So by 2014, I think most of us knew that Viking helmets with horns were a myth, but there were a lot of other pictures about Vikings that people had in their head that they didn't feel were represented by the exhibition. And one of them, of course, was the bloodthirsty warrior. But another one is the trader. And as the author makes clear, people like to believe in one or the other, but they don't really cognitate the fact that most of the historical individuals probably had a combination of factors. There were landholders as well as invaders and raiders, and the invaders and raiders were, without a doubt, often traders. And we know this because there are records of multiple slaves being taken from the British Isles and then sold elsewhere. Anyway. So, the first part of this book is about the Viking raid on Lindisfarne, which is famous and everyone's heard of it and we all know about it. It talks about the devastating shock to the early Christians in Great Britain that someone might not care about their God or the sanctity of their church. And there's a lot of other things. But in order to get the picture of the Viking raid in Lindisfarne, the author gives us this fascinating in-depth review of what was happening in Scandinavia at the time, what was happening in the continent, what political and military forces were pushing north or pushing west, who was in charge of what. So he goes into the emperor in the east, which was Byzantium. He goes into the emperor in the west, which was something beginning with C. My history is really very, very niche. But he talks about all these influences as to why all of a sudden the Viking raiders might have started pushing more towards Great Britain than they maybe had in the past. And I loved that larger picture because there's so many things you can zoom in onto about Battle of the Bridge, Harald Hardrada, all those things that we know about, but the wider picture is what makes it feel real to me personally. Maybe scarlet cloaks and marching through the snow make it feel real to other people. And I think really this book has got a little bit of anything that will make it feel real and interesting to anyone. And if you are a reenactor or interested in history, this book is a fantastic source. There's so much in here that I haven't heard of. And if I can find a real life copy, I'm actually going to buy it so that I can use it as reference in a way that I can't use an audiobook. Okay. Now, having started with the famous Lindisfarne, the author then takes us back further because Lindisfarne, the attack on the Church of St. Cuthbert was in 793, but he actually takes us back earlier than that and talks about the distribution of England, the distribution of the Northlands, the question of Vikings coming from Norway versus Denmark versus Sweden. All of those factors apparently targeted the British Isles at one stage or another, but in different ways. Because he starts with the really early attacks, you build up a picture of England as basically being a Northlander attaché. We've all heard of the Danelaw, and he's got some fascinating comments about the Danelaw. Well, all of us who are into Vikings and that this particular period of his history have heard about the Danelaw. Most of us know how much of the Scandinavian languages are actually present in modern English. But the slow incremental creep of people raiding and settling, of long battles, the story of the Mikelhira, which were basically in the British Isles for years. They didn't go back home for winter. No, they stayed. They built in York at one stage, other cities which they had captured. They were there for decades. I didn't know about that. I knew that York had that strong Viking connection, but not having spent that much time on the Viking era British Isles, I didn't know about so much. And now I know so much more. The trick is to remember it. Now, since I was listening to this as an audiobook, it was tricky for me at times. So Great Britain during the early Middle Ages was very different in terms of kingdoms and autonomy and topography than it is today. And the author actually takes us back to Roman times briefly to talk about the distribution of English power, it wasn't English, United Kingdom Islands power back then. However, in the early Middle Ages, when he's mostly talking about, we've got a couple of different differentiations. So at this point, the conquerors haven't slapped Wales down quite as much, though the Vikings went there more often than I was aware of. And Wales was actually a combination of 4 different kingdoms or principalities. I'm not sure if they're... I think 2 of the rulers could style themselves kings, but the others might have been princes. Anyway, content warning, I'm about to mispronounce Welsh no matter what I do. Sorry about that. I try. It's a beautiful language. I don't speak it. So the northernmost kingdom or principality in Wales was Gwynedd, or Gwynedd. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Down the centre, what is all those amazing national parks these days would be Powys or Pubis, not sure. Then you had Dyfed, which was against the Irish Sea, and then Gwent or Gwynedd, I'm not sure once again how to pronounce that, Gwent, maybe, at the bottom. Then going further across, you had Cornwall, which was then called Damonia. On the eastern side, however, you had all these kingdoms that don't really reflect in anything modern day. You had Northumbria through most of the centre to the north. Then you had Mercia and Wessex in the centre, which I already knew existed. I didn't know too much about them. And then right on the coast, you had East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex. As you can tell from my eye direction, I'm reading this off all of the map. I didn't have a map while I was listening to this book, and that made it tricky at times. I kept saying, going through Northumbria or wanting Mercia or conquering Wessex, and my brain just went, beep. I know the general shape of the United Kingdom, but I haven't been there since I was 19. Been a while. Despite the fact that I couldn't always follow where we were, the descriptions of what was happening in these different kingdoms and how it related to the Vikings or Northlanders or Scandinavian born in those kingdoms was fascinating and made the whole thing so much more real than just pretending that there was a whole heap of invaders that for 100 years wandered into the island and then left, leaving nothing. I think we all knew there was a lot more to it, but what happened was so complicated. So, hello. On to the kingdoms. Since we start, realistically speaking, in the 700s, there weren't really kingdoms at that stage. But the author takes us through the different powers in the land and how they related to Vikings and how often they were Vikings and how often the Vikings were intermarrying. He takes us up to the point where they started intermingling. He talks a lot about the House of Wessex, which ruled England from the 880s to 10s-ish. And then he talks about how England first came to be as a nation. And the Scandinavian contingent there was incredibly part of that whole story, which I found fascinating because I'd never seen it in that worldview before. So the way he describes it, Ethelstan was probably the first king of a united England, and his son, this is Wessex, claims. Wessex down the bottom was apparently a really powerful and influential area, and it kept being ruled and bartered and split up and disagreed with by many of the Viking lords that were there at the time. So there is so much here. I'm not sure how many pages in this book, but it was a really long one to listen to. It took me a couple of weeks, and I had a couple of really long trips during those weeks, so I was glad to have it. Didn't understand all of it, couldn't follow all of the history, definitely couldn't always follow the geography, but the monarchy and the social positioning that the author gives you about all these events is fascinating, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to read more by this author. Apparently this is the first book of his I've ever encountered, but I do want more, and I do recommend it to people who are into the very specific type of things I've described. You could not get further from fiction, really, than this book. But it's so rich, so full of detail, so marvelously drawn together, and it feels so contemporary in its outlook of how the Scandinavian influence helped shape all of Great Britain. So that's probably all I've got to say about it. It brings us up to 1066, when England became a whole different story. It also, of course, covers the spread of Christianity and some hypothesis. It mentions a lot of the archaeological sites where you have used huge types of analysis of bones and teeth and stuff. You know what I mean, don't you? I hope you know what I mean. I'll Google it later. To analyze where bodies actually came from. And it leans more heavily in on English writings than I had any idea existed. So yes, thank you for listening to me rave on about this. The next one will probably be back to science fiction and fantasy. Have a great day. Read good books. If you love history, I really feel like you may do well reading a Thomas Williams or two. Bye.